The time is just gone 8:34 a.m. We continue with this morning's broadcast, and this broadcast is also coming to you live on the Salam Media Facebook page. And we are talking with Dr. Azzam Tamimi, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of Ahiwar TV channel, and the author of Hamas Unwritten Chapters, and Rashid Ghanouchi, a Democrat within Islamism. And we're talking this morning about 10 years after the Arab Spring. The key issue is we know how it started sparking off in Tunisia, and the scenes that we've seen, millions in Tahrir Square, where Hosni Mubarak was ousted. We've seen what has happened out in Bahrain, the explosion in Libya, and we see what has taken place in Syria. But the key question we need to ask ourselves is, 10 years later, what has the Arab Spring achieved? Dr. Azzam Tamimi, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome, and Jazakallah khairan so much for joining us this morning, Dr. Tamimi. Now, looking at the Arab Spring, obviously 10 years later, or 10 years ago, there was so much hope in terms of the waves of change that we were about to see in the Arab world. And if you look at the last 10 years and 10 years later, in your analysis, your assessment of the situation, how do you view the Arab Spring and whether it has really achieved anything or not?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, 10 years ago, or slightly less than 10 years ago, we were imagining a completely different world. We were imagining a world in which the Arabs have become free, have regained their dignity, and were able to rule themselves through genuine democracy. Unfortunately, none of this has happened. Yet, what has happened is that the regimes that rule the Arabs, or that have been ruling the Arabs since the end of the colonial era, have actually been exposed completely. And I think although the first wave of Arab revolutions has not been able to topple all these regimes and replace them with democratic ones, it has set in motion the dynamic, and this dynamic is going to continue. There will probably be a second wave, maybe a third wave, until a full transformation takes place in the region. There is so much repression today. The response to the Arab revolutions has been brutal. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners behind bars in Egypt, in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, all over the region. There is chaos in Yemen. There is chaos in Libya. It is true. Egypt has been sinking socially, economically, and politically. But I think all these are signs that the dictatorships are trying to remain in power against the will of the entire populations of the region, which will continue the struggle.
Well, certainly, Dr. Tamimi. Now, what we've also seen in the last 10 years is the movements, the progressive movements, the movements that have been calling out for human rights, for justice in the Arab world. And the one aspect I'd like to touch on is the neutralization of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, because I think this is very, very prominent. This featured very prominently, very, very profound. And this came even before the removal even of Mohammed Morsi in Egypt.
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is now really a pan-Islamic movement. It's even a global movement, and that's why the war against it is assuming global dimensions. You hear Macron of France, you hear the Americans, you hear the British, you hear the despotic Arabs, all branding the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, simply because this group was trusted by the Arabs to lead it out of this tyranny into a completely different world, a world in which they are free and dignified. And therefore, it is seen today as a threat by those who are protecting the status quo, those who don't want to see change in the region. But foremost among them is Israel itself, and that's why we see today a new alliance forming between Israel on the one hand and the Arab despotic regimes on the other, in what has become known as normalization with Israel. That started with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, followed now by Morocco, and then Sudan a little bit earlier, and likely to be followed by Saudi Arabia. This is the camp that felt threatened by the Arab revolutions. Because you see, once the Arabs are free and once they rule themselves, the Zionist project that has been colonizing Palestine will be threatened, because the Arabs as masses, as peoples, would never consent to the occupation of Palestine by these invaders who came to us from Europe. So the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as the spearhead that is capable of leading the change. And although some people may have the impression that they've been really uprooted completely because of the brutal war against them, I think they continue to be alive in the idea that they're carrying. The idea that we need to be free, we need to be only in servitude to our God, nobody else, no human being, and we need to liberate our countries from foreign intervention. And this happened to the Muslim Brotherhood several times before. It happened in 1949, in 1954, in 1965, and if it is happening now, it is only preparing us for a new phase in this ongoing battle for our freedom.
Dr. Tamimi, just in preparation of the freedom and the liberation of the Arab world, and just to understand the mindset, the psyche of the ordinary Arab, the Arab on the ground. And while all these issues are playing out, the normalization deals with Israel, the dictators, the despotic governments, the Gulf states, people like Sisi, while all of that is playing out in the political landscape, what is the mindset of the average or the ordinary Arab, particularly looking at 10 years down the line, because these waves of revolution were sparked by people on the ground?
Well, the way how the Arabs are thinking today is really difficult to tell, because there's so much repression, and a simple tweet or an expression of an opinion can end someone behind bars without trial, and could even be tortured to death, as we've seen in many cases. Freedom of speech has been banned. Freedom of choice is not on the table. And therefore, it's really difficult to tell collectively what people are thinking today. I can only assume, and I can only hope, that an average Arab thinks the way I think. I want to be free. I want to be ruled by a democratic regime that is accountable to me and to my fellow citizens. And the only moment when the Arabs collectively spoke was when they had the freedom to speak, when we had free elections. And when it happened in Egypt, we saw what the people did. The people chose the Muslim Brotherhood as rulers. And because this likelihood was seen as an almost inevitable occurrence, the despotic regimes rallied together, allied themselves in order to crush the democratic experiment and prevent the transformation from taking place. So if you take to the streets today anywhere in the Arab world and ask people to tell you what they think, they'll probably not tell you what they think, because they are so frightened, they are so afraid. I mean, we've seen in Saudi Arabia, for instance, prominent scholars jailed, and they continue to be in jail simply because one of them, like Salman al-Auda, for instance, made a dua. He said, "Oh Allah, bring the hearts of the Arabs together." And this was interpreted by the ruler of Saudi Arabia, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, as going against his will of imposing siege on neighboring Qatar. So you can see even a simple dua is not tolerated. Today there are scholars, there are thinkers, there are academics who are in jail simply because they dared express a free opinion. I assume from my knowledge of my neighborhood, of my relatives, of the people I talk to, that the Arab feelings have not changed. They are still the way they were 10 years ago. They long for freedom, they long for change, but people are really terrified for their lives.
Yes, and just finally looking at the Palestinians, because obviously we know with the latest normalization deals, there's been the biggest slap in the face or the kick in the teeth for the people of Palestine as well. And Palestinians have been on the losing side for far too long. There was a bit of hope when the Arab Spring had started, when Mubarak was taken out, the brief period when Mohammed Morsi was around, there was still some hope for the people of Palestine, Gaza as well. But all of that seems to be no avail, and Palestinians are actually worse off now than what they have been. And now they've got to not only contend with Israel, but you're talking about Zionist-friendly Arab nations as well.
Well, what you have described is the picture as it looks on the surface of it. But let me look at it in a slightly different manner. The fact that the Zionists and their allies in the West, as well as their new coalition partners in the region, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, they're trying to squeeze the Palestinians more and more. That shows that the Zionist enterprise is in trouble, is in real crisis. The Zionists, after more than 80 years of occupation, after nearly more than 70 years, now it's 72 years since they occupied Palestine, they are still not confident about their project because the Palestinians are still there. The Palestinians are struggling. The entire world knows now more than at any time before that the Palestinians have been oppressed, that they have the right to fight for their rights and to regain their freedom in their own country. So we don't see it that I'm not that pessimistic about what's going on, because when all these wolves come and try and attack you, that means that you are still alive. You are still alive and kicking, and the struggle will continue. Look at the people of Gaza. Despite the siege, they've been under siege for so many years now. Since 2026, it's almost 14 years now. They've been under siege, and their children are still demonstrating along the barbed wire that the Israelis set up to separate them from their original lands in mainland Palestine. The struggle is on, the struggle is continuing, and I think all this normalization project is a desperate attempt to save Israel, but it will not be saved.
Well, Dr. Tamimi, as always, we thank you. We say Jazakallah khairan to you for your time with us this morning here on Salam Media. We wish you all the best, inshallah. Allah accept, Allah reward your efforts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Dr. Azzam Tamimi joining us this morning on Salam Media. We're going for a break. We come back. It's Crime Talk with Itikwini Sikio.